If you choose to embrace the how do we feel conversation, you are harnessing a neurochemical process that powers our most important relationships. How do we feel is critical because it reveals what's happening inside our heads and opens a path to connection. The power of questions. Once upon a time, Nick Epley had been a very bad listener. So bad, in fact, it almost ruined his life. He had grown up in a small town in Iowa, a high school football star, as strutting and self-assured as you might imagine. Then one night during his junior year, he was driving home from a boozy party, weaving across the lanes, when he was pulled over for drunk driving. The cop saw Epley's Letterman's jacket, which seemed to trigger a pity for youthful stupidity. So instead of putting him in handcuffs, he delivered a lecture. If you don't turn your life around, you're going to end up somewhere ugly. Then he called Epley's parents and told them to come get their son. Over the next few weeks, his mother and father lectured him relentlessly about the dangers of this path he was on. They told Epley they understood how hard it was to be a teenager. They realized he wanted to impress his friends and test his limits. They sympathized with his desire to experiment. After all, once upon a time, they had been teenagers themselves. But they were worried he was making bad choices. Epley hardly paid attention. It kind of washed over me, he told me. They were just adults saying the things that adults are supposed to say. A few months later, he was pulled over for drunk driving a second time. A different cop gave him another similar lecture, and once again let him off after calling his folks. At that point, his parents decided it was time for professional help. Epley started meeting with a counselor and braced himself for more lectures and criticisms. But the counselor was completely unlike his parents, not to mention most of the other adults he had met. She didn't give speeches or tell him he needed to turn his life around. She didn't say she understood where he was coming from or give him advice. Instead, she simply asked questions. Why were you drinking? How would you have reacted if your car had hit someone? What would have happened to your life if you had been arrested or had injured yourself or had killed another person? I had to sit with that, Epley told me. I couldn't pretend I didn't know the answers. The questions themselves didn't ask about Epley's emotions, but inevitably he became emotional as he responded to them. They pushed Epley to talk about his beliefs and values, how he felt, what he was anxious about, what he feared. He came home from each session exhausted and ashamed, scared and angry, and most of all confused, a complicated mix of feelings that usually took days to untangle. These were some of the most emotionally intense conversations of his life, even though the therapist never asked him to describe his feelings. These sessions also seemed to unlock something. Epley began talking to his parents about what he was feeling and listening for the first time as they described their own emotional lives. Epley's dad mentioned a day a few years earlier when Epley had left the house early in the morning without telling his parents. They went into the basement looking for him and saw a rifle was missing. They panicked. Was he going to kill himself? His father described his grief and terror until Epley came home, unharmed and annoyed by his parents' worry, peevishly explaining that he had gone hunting with his friends. As his father recounted the day, Epley could remember that moment, could remember that his dad had been upset, how he had brushed off his parents' panic because it seemed so ridiculous at the time. He hadn't been able to hear what they were trying to say. They wanted him to understand that he was loved. But love carries obligations to be safe, to tell others when you leave or where you're going, not to dismiss a parent's worries. That conversation changed our relationship, Epley told me. I felt so lucky I was finally able to see him as this real, complex person. After his second session with the counselor, Epley decided he wouldn't drink anymore. Then he decided to get serious about school. Eventually, he enrolled at St. Olaf College, where he discovered psychology. After getting his degree, he entered a PhD program at Cornell. While there, Epley began thinking more deeply about why, after those near arrests, he had been so unwilling to listen at first. Sometimes you look back and you wonder, why was I so deaf, he told me. Why hadn't the police officer's lectures scared him straight? Why had it been so easy to ignore his parents when they had pleaded, cajoled, and tried so earnestly to help him? By 2005, Epley was a professor at the University of Chicago. He was married, starting to have kids of his own, and terrified that someday they would become teenagers who shut him out and refused to listen. He wanted to understand how to convince them to hear him. At the time, one prevailing theory within psychology said that in order to understand others and persuade them to listen to us, we should engage in what is known as perspective taking. We should try to see a situation from the other person's perspective and show them that we empathize. Psychology journals noted that to communicate effectively, we must adopt the perspective of another person, both while speaking and listening. Textbooks taught that perspective taking not only fosters greater interpersonal understanding, but also constitutes a vital skill for very powerful negotiators. When Epley looked back on his high school experiences, he realized that his parents, in their own way, had been trying to engage in perspective taking after his drunk driving near arrests. They had tried to put themselves in his shoes. They had tried to forge a connection by imagining the pressure he was under. They had hoped that demonstrating their empathy would convince him to listen to their advice.